It sounds like a cruel fiction, something out of a twisted tale. But in Victorian England, a man could take his wife to the market, place a rope around her neck, wrist, or waist, and auction her off to the highest bidder. This was not a myth. This was real. And it wasn't just one bizarre instance. It was a pattern, a social custom that unfolded in the shadows of a rigid, patriarchal society. To understand this disturbing reality, we must go back to a time when marriage was not about love, but control, property, and status. In 19th century England, divorce was nearly impossible for the common man. The laws were brutal. Only the rich could afford the legal process, and women had virtually no say in the matter. A husband could lock his wife away, beat her, and deny her access to her children or property. But if a poor man wanted to rid himself of a wife, he had limited options. That's when the strange custom of wife selling emerged, not legally sanctioned, but widely tolerated. The wife selling ritual often took place in public markets, surrounded by crowds. It might begin with a man declaring his intention, usually by writing a notice or verbally announcing the sale. He would then place a rope around his wife, sometimes symbolic, often humiliating, and lead her through the marketplace. Buyers would examine her, just like livestock. Offers were made. If a man accepted an offer, a symbolic contract was struck. Sometimes the new husband paid with beer or coin. Sometimes he promised to take care of her. And sometimes the woman had no say at all. But this wasn't always a story of oppression. In some cases, wives agreed to the sale. In a world where they had few rights and fewer choices, this ritual was, strangely, a way out. If a woman wanted to escape a violent or loveless marriage, and another man was willing to buy her, the sale became her ticket to freedom. The community, though morally conflicted, often turned a blind eye. The sale, in this strange social compromise, was both rebellion and resignation. Newspapers at the time recorded these events with a mix of scandal and acceptance. One article might describe a husband leading his wife with a halter around her neck, ending with a new man taking her home. Another might mock the custom, while acknowledging it had happened dozens of times before. Historians uncovered story after story, some involving drunken husbands, others where wives demanded the sale themselves. Why did Victorian society tolerate this? Because it was built on contradictions. Public decency and moral superiority were preached from every pulpit. Yet behind closed doors, women were beaten, silenced, and sold. Marriage was a transaction, not a bond of affection. A woman's worth was tied to her obedience, her ability to bear children, and her dowry. So, when the marriage soured, and the law offered no mercy, men took to the markets. There were cases when the public intervened. A sale might be stopped by outraged onlookers, or a magistrate might charge the husband with disorderly conduct. But more often, the system shrugged. Some wives, after being sold, built new lives. Others fell into deeper poverty. There were no happy endings promised, only in exchange, and the hope of something less cruel. One particularly haunting account tells of a woman sold for a shilling and a quart of beer. Her husband was drunk, the crowd rowdy, and the buyer barely better. The woman's face, pale and still, betrayed no joy or fear, just quiet resignation. The transaction ended. They walked away, and the town returned to normal, as if nothing grotesque had occurred. But the stain remained, on the streets, on history, and on humanity itself. The deeper truth is that this act, horrifying as it was, represented something larger. Victorian England wore a mask of progress and decorum. Beneath it, inequality thrived. Women were property. Poor men had no power. And the market, loud, chaotic, uncaring, became the stage where lives were traded and dignity was lost. It was not only in the villages that wife selling took place. Even in growing industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham, such stories emerged. Workers too poor to afford divorce chose the spectacle instead. Some used taverns or pubs as selling grounds. Others waited for the Sunday markets, when the crowds were thick and the gossip hungry. In a time when newspapers became more common, stories of wife selling made their way to readers across the country. Each tale stirred a mix of shame, outrage, and fascination. But it wasn't until much later, when public pressure and changing laws began to shift the narrative, that this grim tradition began to fade. Still, for decades, it persisted, not because it was law, but because it was tolerated. The sale of a wife might seem like an unthinkable crime today, but in that world, it was sometimes seen as a solution. In a society where women had no legal identity apart from their husbands, this grim ritual, terrifying and twisted, was a desperate attempt at freedom for both buyer and seller. But freedom, when gained through humiliation, always carries a price. That it is a chapter in history that England does not advertise. Yet it reveals the layers of a society built on power, silence, and survival. And the women who walked through those markets, sold, forgotten, or free, deserve to be remembered not just for their suffering. As the wife-selling custom grew, it developed patterns, rituals, and even strange forms of community support. In some cases, the sale was not sudden or violent, but rather arranged in advance. A wife and her future buyer might have already begun a relationship, sometimes even living together in secret before the sale. The public auction then became a symbolic gesture to end the previous marriage officially in the eyes of neighbors. It was not law, but it was local tradition, a poor man's divorce court. What made the entire practice more disturbing was the public's often casual reaction. Crowds would gather to watch, sometimes laughing, sometimes drinking, sometimes bidding. Children saw it. Women watched. No one intervened. They didn't because, in their eyes, this was not an outrage. It was a known, if frowned upon, ritual of the lower classes. The elite viewed it as another reason to look down on the poor, but rarely did they push for reform. And the poor? They saw it as a way to fix what the law ignored. It is important to remember that many of these men were trapped by the very system they used. A working-class husband who could not provide for his family, who had been shamed, betrayed, or beaten by life, found himself with no legal escape. Marriage was for life. A mistake could not be undone. Divorce laws, before the 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act, required a private act of Parliament, something only the extremely rich could manage. So for a laborer, a miner, or a farmer, selling a wife was a form of rebellion and release. But it came at a cost. Not all sales were clean, not all buyers were kind, and not all women escaped hardship. In many cases, the new husbands were no better, and the women went from one miserable life to another. Sometimes, the sale resulted in a fist fight. If the woman resisted, or the crowd turned, chaos erupted. In a few cases, wives fled mid-sale, disappearing into the countryside, never to be seen again. It was a drama played out under open skies, with freedom always just out of reach. One recorded story tells of a wife named Anne, who was sold by her husband after years of quarrels. She was in love with the buyer, a neighbor. The sale was public, and Anne went willingly. They left together, hand in hand. The town gossiped, the husband got drunk, and life moved on. But a few months later, the man she ran away with beat her and left her penniless. With no legal rights, no home to return to, and no name in the records, and vanished into history. A footnote in a cruel tradition. The idea that wife selling was accepted hides the shame that many families carried afterward. Children who saw their mothers sold often grew up traumatized. Some would later deny it ever happened. Others would tell the story, shaking their heads in disbelief. The memory clung to families like a shadow. And yet, the law still looked away. As the Victorian era progressed, voices began to rise in protest. Social reformers, clergymen, and even journalists started speaking out. In pamphlets and papers, they exposed the cruelty of the practice. They called it barbaric, degrading, and immoral. But even their efforts struggled against centuries of silence. Because for too long, society had turned wife selling into a joke, a spectacle, or a tradition, not a human rights violation. The real turning point came with legal reform. The 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act, though flawed, allowed ordinary people to seek divorce through civil courts. It was still expensive, but it cracked the door open. Over the years, more acts followed, giving women the right to keep their earnings, to have custody of children, and to challenge abuse. Slowly, the need for such backdoor customs faded. Wife selling didn't vanish overnight, but it no longer had the cover of helplessness. Now, there were alternatives. Still, the practice lingered in the darkest corners. In some rural areas, sales were reported as late as the early 1900s. One case involved a man who traded his wife for a cow. Another involved a woman who insisted on being sold because she hated her husband. She was bought by a man she liked. She lived with him until his death. It was twisted, yes, but it was a story of control reclaimed, at least for her. Why does this history matter today? Because it shows what happens when people are denied dignity, rights, and voice. It shows how customs born of desperation can evolve into social norms. And it reminds us that laws alone are not enough. Societies must change from the inside. Public shame must be met with public courage. Silence must be broken by truth. There were stories of wives who resisted, who refused to be led like cattle. One woman struck her husband in the face as he announced the sale, grabbed the coins from the buyer, and walked away alone. Her laughter echoed through the market as the men stood stunned. She didn't want a new husband. She wanted herself back. These small rebellions mattered. They were sparks in the darkness, moments when the cruelty cracked. And even when the law did nothing, these women made choices, flawed, painful, brave choices. Their strength lies not in being sold, but in surviving a world where that was considered normal. What is perhaps most tragic is that many of these women left no records behind. Their names are forgotten, their faces unremembered, but their lives shaped a history that cannot be erased. In the dirt of those markets, in the echo of those auctions, in the quiet steps of women walking away from their past, there is a truth that demands to be told. The men who sold their wives were not always monsters. Some were desperate. Some were cruel. Some were simply following what they believed was acceptable. But that does not excuse the practice. It reveals a deeper failure, a society that let it happen, a system that offered no protection to the most vulnerable, and a culture that believed women could be owned. Even now, in museums and archives across England, you can find records, faded documents, court reports, letters describing these sales. They are disturbing. They are real. They are not just about the past, but a warning for the present. Because when the powerful grow indifferent and the weak are silenced, cruelty finds new ways to thrive. As the 19th century moved forward, England began to change. The Industrial Revolution was transforming cities and lives, and with it, social awareness slowly started to grow. Newspapers were no longer limited to the elite. Literacy was spreading. Among the working class, voices that were once silenced began to emerge. And among these voices were those of women. Women who had been bought, sold, abandoned, or forgotten. One such voice was that of a woman named Hannah, who wrote a letter to a local paper after witnessing a wife sale in her town. In her letter, she asked, "How can a nation speak of honor and empire when it allows its women to be led by rope like beasts?" Her letter was ignored by many, but a few papers printed it. Her question lingered in the minds of those who dared to read it not as a complaint, but as a challenge. And yet, while the idea of wife selling was slowly being shamed out of existence, in cities, it still lingered in smaller villages, where the weight of tradition was heavier than the reach of law. In such places, a man's word was often enough to justify his actions, and a woman's silence was mistaken for consent. There was a case in Yorkshire where a woman was sold in broad daylight, with a note pinned to her chest that read, "To be sold, a good woman, hardworking, but nagging." The man who bought her was known to be kinder than her husband, and she reportedly lived peacefully with him. But the image of that note remains etched in the memory of history, a twisted reminder of how casually human lives were bartered. That it wasn't always poverty that fueled the sale, it was power. Men used the act not just to escape a marriage, but to humiliate their wives, to make a public spectacle of dominance, to reduce a human being to a price. And this, more than anything else, reveals the deep cruelty of the custom. Because behind the jokes, the beer, and the markets was a violence that didn't always bruise the skin, but scarred the soul. The long-term effects of this practice were generational. Daughters grew up believing their value was negotiable. Sons learned that love could be traded. Whole communities carried the weight of these stories, whispering them as warnings or hiding them in shame. And yet, it happened again and again, passed off as tradition, as folklore, as something quaint from a time gone by. But there were moments of clarity, moments when someone stood up. A clergyman once interrupted a wife sale in Somerset by standing between the buyer and the seller, declaring that no man had the right to own another human being. He was ridiculed, but the sale stopped. It didn't change the world, but it changed that one woman's life. These were the seeds of change, small, often invisible, but powerful. By the end of the Victorian era, public attitudes had shifted enough that wife selling was no longer seen as acceptable, even in the poorest corners. It was mocked, condemned, and finally, criminalized. The newspapers that once reported it with humor now printed it with disgust. The practice dwindled into a shameful memory, one that society wished to bury. And yet, even in the 20th century, echoes of this dark tradition surfaced. In 1928, a man in Leeds attempted to sell his wife in a local pub. He was arrested, not for the sale, but for disturbing the peace. The legacy of wife selling didn't just vanish. It was suppressed, covered up, forgotten by choice. But it remained. In records, in stories, in wounds passed down silently. What makes this history more haunting is the silence of its victims. Most of the women sold never spoke on record. Their voices were not preserved in books or courtrooms. They were not interviewed. Their pain was not written down. All we have are the accounts of men, husbands, buyers, onlookers. The women's side of the story lives only in the margins, in scattered quotes, in the way they were described or remembered. But even that is enough to sense their fear, their dignity, their strength. There were women who resisted not with fists or cries, but with their gaze. They stood in the market, rope around their waist, and stared into the crowd, unbroken. There were others who found love in unexpected places, carving out joy where none should have existed. Some lived quietly after the sale, raising children and tending homes, while others vanished into cities to start again under new names. Each one carried a story the world never fully heard. This hidden history is not just about Victorian men selling their wives. It is about what happens when power is unchecked and law turns its head. It is about how society creates customs to cope with injustice and how those customs become normalized until someone decides to say no. It is about the resilience of women who endured, resisted, or simply survived. Today, when we speak of gender equality, of rights, of consent, we must remember how far we've come and how recently this cruelty existed. Wife selling was not ancient history. It happened in the streets, markets, and taverns of modern England just a few lifetimes ago. And it wasn't hidden. It was seen. It was witnessed. And too often, it was accepted. The shocking truth is not just that Victorian men sold their wives. It's that for a time, almost everyone let them. In remembering this, we do more than revisit a shameful chapter. We ensure it is never repeated. We give voice to the women whose lives were traded like goods, and we honor the quiet defiance that allowed them to endure. Their names may be lost, but their stories, once told, will never be silent again.